Hello, and welcome to Politics for the People. I am your host, Michael Striano. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to join in the conversation on Patreon or Instagram at Politics for the People Podcast. And please leave us a review and share the podcast. It really helps us out. Okay, let's get to it. And our topic today is the Electoral College. For a lot of us, it's probably something you're reminded of every 4 years. You get annoyed hearing about it for a few months, then you forget it again. But what is it? Where did it come from? How does it work? And how does it affect our daily lives? We all know by now that the Electoral College is what really decides who wins the presidential election and not the popular vote. But how do we get this thing? Where did it come from? So first of all, what is the Electoral College? How does it work? Let's start with a quick definition. The Electoral College is a group of state delegates or representatives who cast the final votes for President and Vice President of the United States. Those votes are decided by the state's popular vote. So how you vote tells your electoral delegation how to vote. And the amount of Electoral College delegates per state is equal to the congressional delegation from that state. So basically, you add however many representatives in the House you have, plus your 2 state senators. So you look at states with a lower population, like Vermont, Wyoming, South Dakota. They can never have less than 3 electoral votes. So how does it work? After Election Day, the electoral delegation for each state get together to cast, sign, seal, and certify their votes, which they then send to the President of the Senate, or the Vice President. A joint session of Congress convenes to open and count the votes. If a candidate receives more than half of the votes, they become the next president. So now, a little background. Where did the Electoral College come from? Who came up with this system? To answer that, we have to jump back in time to the summer of 1787. It's hot, sticky, everyone's wearing wool and powdered wigs, but more importantly, the Revolutionary War is over, and a convention is meeting to determine what this new American experiment will look like and how it will be governed. The Constitutional Convention is coming to a close, and there's still one big issue that hasn't been sorted out yet. How do we elect our leaders? A couple of ideas are floated. Should it be by popular vote and let the people decide? Should we hold a congressional election and let the elected representatives decide the president and vice president? They can't come to an agreement. So they put a group in a room and say, don't come out until you have an answer. When they finally emerge, their solution is a system whereby the people vote, and based on those results, a group of appointed electors cast a second round of ballots to determine who will win the election. It was seen as a compromise between the popular and congressional votes, but by multiple accounts, it was settled upon so everyone could go home and they would amend the process later as needed. Our first official test of this system came in 1796 with the retirement of George Washington. We no longer had a clear leader, and 2 prominent political parties had developed: the Federalists, led by John Adams, and the Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. At this time, there were no tickets as we know them today. Votes were cast for an individual candidate, with the winner becoming president and the runner-up being the vice president. In 1797, when the votes were tabulated, no candidate had received a majority of the vote. So what's called a contingent election was had, meaning the House of Representatives voted between the leading candidates to determine the president and vice president. In the end, Adams prevailed, despite Jefferson actually having won more electoral votes in the initial election. What we had was a split executive branch, with the president and vice president representing opposing parties. In response to this frustrating divide, Jefferson made an agreement with Aaron Burr, and in the election of 1800, they ran together as a unified Republican ticket. Problem was, the system wasn't built for this. Electoral delegates each cast 2 ballots, and they weren't sure how to vote for the pair, so they cast 1 ballot for each member of the ticket, which resulted in a tie. For the second time in 2 elections, the system had failed to produce a winner, and another contingent election was had. All were in agreement the system needed some tweaking, so they set to work and passed the 12th Amendment. Ratified in 1804, the amendment stated that electors would still cast 2 votes, but one would be for president and the other for vice president. Also, should another contingent election be had, the House of Representatives would vote to elect the president, and the Senate would elect the vice president. This was the only time in our history that the electoral system in our country was altered. So, what does this mean for us? How does all of this affect our daily lives? The quick and easy answer is it determines who runs the country, right? But let's look a little deeper at what that means. Back in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention, the idea of just having the popular vote was raised, but there were skeptics who were concerned about putting so much power in the hands of the people with no possible congressional influence. The foundational idea that led to the creation of the Electoral College was to essentially disenfranchise voters, or have their individual votes be less impactful. As the country grew and expanded, this became increasingly evident, so that today, the average single vote in a less populous state, say Vermont, Wyoming, North Dakota, carries over 2 3/4 the weight of an individual's vote in a more populous state like New York, Texas, or California. While the Constitutional Convention knew they were influencing the balance of electoral power, they couldn't have dreamed how the Electoral College would cement the integrity of the 2-party system. Of the 50 states in our union, plus the District of Columbia, only 2 states, Nebraska and Maine, have what is called proportional representation, meaning their electoral votes don't all go to whomever wins the state's popular vote. Each district within the state gets 1 electoral vote, and whoever wins the statewide popular vote gets an additional 2 electoral votes. The other 48 states and the District of Columbia are winner-take-all, meaning the second-place finisher gets nothing. Without the massive platform and name recognition provided by one of the 2 main party platforms, it can be daunting just to win 1 state, although it can and has been done. For a third-party candidate to have a chance of winning a state, they have to raise a substantial amount of money and campaign vigorously in one particular state or region, things which are significantly more difficult to do when trying to prove viability as a candidate. Third-party candidates are more often seen as disruptors, attempting to push certain issues to the forefront, most recently the environment, rather than stage an actual upset. With these reasons compounded, it isn't hard to believe that no third-party candidate has succeeded in winning a single state's electoral votes since 1968, when the system was so abused and turned on its head we nearly abolished the Electoral College. Leading up to that 1968 election, George Wallace, a loud and proud segregationist, found himself basically expelled from the Democratic Party, which was then still very much entrenched in the Southern Dixiecrat model. Upset at not being taken seriously for what were then very common views and opinions, Wallace staged the epitome of a disruption campaign. For all the reasons we've just listed, he knew he couldn't win the election. So he instead tried to use the Electoral College against itself and prevent either Hubert Humphrey or Richard Nixon from achieving an electoral majority. Once a contingent election had been declared, Wallace would hold his sway in the House of Representatives over the candidates, awarding the election to whomever would endorse his segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever platform. As we know, Wallace's plan failed when he fell short of preventing Nixon from winning an electoral majority, though he did win 5 states and 46 electoral votes. What is surprising, however, is that California's electoral votes were decided by a margin of only 1.55%, and very nearly gave Wallace his disruptive victory. In the wake of the election, Nixon and Humphrey lobbied Congress to abolish the Electoral College, having seen that the country was very nearly held hostage by the very system meant to ensure its democracy. Since then, we've seen a number of high-profile third-party candidates condemned by both sides for being disruptors and giving elections to one party. Ross Perot, Ralph Nader, and Jill Stein being some recent examples. In the wake of the 2000 and 2016 elections, there have been renewed calls for abolishing the Electoral College, when for the first time since the 1800s, the Electoral College winner actually lost the popular vote. Looking at the history of the Electoral College, it's clear to see the members of the Constitutional Convention were caught in an impasse and needed an answer. What we got was simply the most palatable solution, to be edited later. What resulted was a system that could be manipulated by an influential few to bend against the will of the people. But at the end of the day, it's all up to us, the American people, to be engaged. We have the power to influence change. We just have to want to do it. So what do you think? Does the Electoral College work? Does it need another alteration, or would you prefer a national popular vote? Or do you have another idea altogether? Thanks for listening, and a special thanks to our patrons on Patreon for your help in making this happen, and to all those who have reviewed us. We love hearing what you think, and we're glad you're enjoying the show. But we want to hear from more of you. Do you have a question or a topic you'd like to hear covered on the show? Let us know by emailing us at politicsforthepeoplepodcast@gmail.com, or hit us up on Patreon or Instagram at politicsforthepeoplepodcast. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps us out. We'll be back in your feed soon. Take care.